Hi, my name is Amma Girish, and I'm the author of a transformational memoir titled Losing Amma, Finding Home, a memoir about love, loss, and life's detours. This book was published by Hay House in 2014. It was the spring of 2008 when my husband, 14-year-old daughter, and I moved all the way from India to the US. 10 days after we moved to Chicago, my mother, who was 68 at the time, was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. Sadly, her story did not have a happy ending. She passed away in January of 2009, just 8 months after the initial diagnosis. This event rocked my world. It plunged me into a deep darkness of despair and sadness. I couldn't pull myself up from that very dark place for a long time. But it was also a period of deep soul searching. It was a time when I asked the big life questions like, who am I? What is the meaning of life? How can I live my life more meaningfully? What is the purpose for why I exist? These questions crowded every waking space in my mind. And these are the questions that led me to my second chapter, my soul's divine purpose. In finding and living more meaningfully according to the dictates of my soul, in choosing to follow what I was put on earth to do, I have found deep happiness, deep satisfaction, and a wonderful sense of well-being by living on purpose. And that is the story I tell in my book, Losing Amma, Finding Home, a memoir about love, loss, and life's detours. This is what it looks like.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host. For this episode, we're talking to Amma Girish, the author of Losing Amma, Finding Home, a memoir about love, loss, and life's detours. So, Amma, welcome to AuthorStory. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Alexander. It's great to be here talking with you.
Oh, cool. So, let's begin by telling something about yourself in your book. How did this come about? How did Amma Girish, the storyteller, begin?
Well, Amma Girish, the storyteller, was a storyteller as a 6-year-old.
Okay.
I loved stories. I was a storyteller when I was a little child because my grandmother, who told me stories from the great Indian epics, made sure that my mind and my imagination were cultivated at a very young age. And from there grew my love of story and love of reading, which then led me to explore different kinds of books. I grew up to be a voracious reader. I started writing from a very young age. I would write little essays about trips and vacations that the family went on. And my father would then give a cash prize to the best essay written by one of the 4 siblings. And it ended up that I always won the prize, and my siblings were very annoyed about that because I was the oldest and they felt that I had the biggest and best vocabulary.
Okay.
But anyway, that sort of motivated me to keep writing more. And soon I was writing articles and short stories. I've been published in 7 countries around the world, have won several awards for my writing.
Nice.
And so the book was the culmination because I wanted to tell a story on a bigger canvas than 1,500 to 3,000 words.
Right.
And my mother's passing provided sort of the platform, I should say, to tell a bigger story about life, its journey and transformation.
All right. So it's really like you're really like a storyteller from the start then, and this just like another big step in that storytelling aspect.
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. Fantastic. So you're known as a grief guide, dream coach, and a bereavement volunteer in a hospice. And you also have a podcast for your own, correct? Called, I think it's The Grammar of Grief.
Yes, Grammar of Grief.
Okay, got that. So what is it that attracts you so much to the topic of grief? I mean, this is something that a lot of us usually shy away from or tuck away in some dark, hidden corner of ourselves.
Yes, that's very true, Alexander. Not too many people want to talk about grief and loss. These are very dark, difficult topics to deal with.
Mm.
However, grief chose me. I didn't choose grief. You know how it is when your calling finds you and when it gets into your heart, it doesn't let you go. And that's what happened when my mother passed away in January of 2009.
Okay.
We had moved about 8 months prior to that, all the way from India to Chicago to begin a
Mm.
new life in this country. And my mother's cancer diagnosis and her death at age 68, just few months after we had moved, it just plunged me into the depths of despair and darkness.
Right.
And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to do grief. No one teaches you how to do grief, right?
Yeah,
We grow
true.
up not knowing what the tools are, how to cope, how to deal with this overwhelming sadness when someone we love dies. And
Right.
so it was the beginning of a transformational education for me. I had to venture deeply into the areas of grief and loss and work with teachers and masters in order to heal myself. And in the process of transforming and healing my own broken heart,
Right.
I came to realize that this was my calling. This
Mm.
is what I'm meant to do. This is what my soul craved.
Mm.
And I understood that the true value of the healing experience through my mother's passing was in sharing it with others who are walking in similar shoes.
Mm. Okay. All right. I got that. So it's sort of like this really came about from your mother's passing rather than something that interests you from the start.
Oh, yeah, because when we moved to the United States, I was trained as a Cambridge University facilitator. I taught business English in India, and my plan when we moved to the States was to teach English as a second language for immigrants.
Okay.
And so that's what I came here planning to
Mm.
do. However, the universe and God had other plans for me. The doors that I expected to open shut firmly, and other doors that I didn't know I was meant to walk through opened wide.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Cool. So this book is actually a memoir, more or less. I mean, it is a memoir. My mistake. And I'm
Yes.
sure there's a lot in here that's very personal.
Mhm.
Given that a lot of people usually don't want really personal stuff to be publicly read, what inspired you to write the book?
Again, I was between writing projects and thinking about what came next when I knew without a shadow of doubt that I was meant to tell the story of my transformation through my mother's passing.
Hmm.
And I started writing it. Being a seasoned writer, I know that as you're writing a story, you don't focus on the eventual outcome. In other words, if I were thinking about who's going to read it and how am I going to share these very intimate personal details of my journey,
Hmm.
and what if people judge me? Will people like what I'm saying? Will they
Hmm.
still approve of me? If I get caught up in questions like that or concerns like that, then I'm not going to do a good job of telling the story.
Hmm.
I knew that I had to tell the story. Yes, concerns lurked in the background about how the story might be received by some family members.
Right.
But when the book was done and when I got the contract from Hay House, I knew that this story was bigger than, my little universe.
Hmm.
This story was meant to go out into the world and connect with the universal story of grief and loss. Grief and loss are part of the human experience. Everybody has grief and loss in their lives.
Yes.
So, in telling my story with as much honesty and authenticity as I could, I was helping others connect with the threads of their own personal journeys of grief and loss. So,
Hmm.
I knew that I couldn't be too bothered about um, being outed by my family or expecting approval and acclaim from them. I knew that in stepping into the courage of telling my story truthfully,
Right.
the book would serve a greater good in the world.
Hmm. I got that. But was there any particular instant or realization that made you decide to write the book, or made you think, this should really be written. This should really be out there.
I guess as I started walking down this journey where I took a fork in the road after my mother's passing, I came into contact with many people who were experiencing a similar shift in their lives. In other words, the day jobs that they went to did not give them the satisfaction that they were craving. Their soul was calling them to do something different.
Right.
And in my own case, I followed that calling of my soul. And in following the calling of the soul, new doors opened for me, new experiences came into my life. My life, even though the journey had come through grief and loss, I was in a much better place. I was happy to wake up in the morning and go to work and do what my soul really was here to do.
Right.
And so I knew that when I told that story, many people would connect with it. Many people who were struggling to follow the dictates of their soul and were stuck in following what they believed was their life because they needed to pay the bills or needed to remain in their safe comfort zone.
Right.
My story gave them a voice to be able to then explore what was true for them. So I knew that the purpose of my book was much bigger than even I was seeing, and that impelled me to write it.
Right. Okay, I got that. Now, I'm aware that you kept a journal throughout the time of your mother's illness. How did keeping a journal help you work through the situation while the illness was progressing, and then maybe even afterwards as you dealt with it?
It's only in hindsight that I know the value of that journal.
Oh, okay.
The day we received news of her cancer diagnosis, one of the first things my husband said to me is, I'm going to drive you to Barnes & Noble and I think you should buy a journal. So at that moment, it wasn't even a conscious thought that this journal would become really important in the way I told the story and remembered the events. I didn't even know at that point that a book was going to emerge from this experience.
Okay.
So we drove to Barnes & Noble's. I bought myself a beautiful red journal, and I started writing down my thoughts and feelings in it because, as my husband put it very well, he knows me really well. He said, you process your emotions and thoughts best when you write them down.
Right.
And that was such a gift because that journal and the pages in the journal filled up with everything that I went through, every event, every day, the disappointments, the frustrations, the fear, the anxiety, the good days, the bad moments, everything went into that journal. And it was a record of what I had been through. So I could remember what kind of a day I woke up to 6 months, into my mother's diagnosis, what my sister said on the phone when she called me, what the doctor's medical reports said, what the day was like, what the temperature, the weather was like, all those details that you can forget in a moment were all truthfully recorded in the journal. So the journal was an invaluable tool in helping me recreate the experiences and remember some of the things that I had forgotten. Because when you're going through grief and loss, you're in this fog. You don't remember where you put your car keys, leave alone anything else. So this journal was really, really valuable to me as I told the story.
Okay, got that. And did it help you? As you mentioned, did it like help you handle the situation as it happened?
Oh, definitely. Like I said, I've always written about my feelings, thoughts, and emotions from the time I was little. So it was very cathartic for me to be able to express my anger and my fear and anxiety onto the pages, because the page is a very willing listener. The page doesn't judge you. It doesn't talk back to you. It doesn't justify something.
Right.
So it felt like a very safe place for me to go to with the struggles and challenges of that experience.
Okay, I got that. So, speaking from personal experience, would you recommend people to keep a journal if they're going through grief at right now in their lives?
Journaling is a definite must for all my clients who work with me. I always encourage them to keep a journal, to write down their feelings, because feelings that are unexpressed become trapped in the cells of our bodies, and that's what leads to disease and illness. So keeping a journal serves many many purposes. One is that you're able to let go of things that you're struggling to hold on to. It gives you a safe space to vent your feelings and emotions. Writing is a daily practice that is meditative.
Right.
You feel very peaceful in the time that you spend writing your thoughts and feelings down. And you also, as you go through your grief and loss journey, when you look back on the entries you've written, say, a couple of months ago, you will actually see physical progress of how much you have changed, how much you have improved as a human being, how well you have been dealing with this challenge. And that gives you the confidence to keep moving.
Okay, all right, cool. So that's that's a little tip right there for some of our listeners who may be going through grief. All right, just to acknowledge this to our listeners, at present I have a bit of a cold, so if you hear something strange in my voice or some muffled cough in the background, please ignore it. Okay, so getting back to the interview, Uma, the book doesn't deal about illness and its after effects, but it's also a story of transition from you, since as you said, your mother was diagnosed 8 months after you moved from India to the United States. Um, it's moving from one place to another is a real challenge, and in addition to on top of that, you had the situation of your mother. So in that regard, what kept you going through all these stresses? What kept you going through all these challenges?
I would say that it was service.
Service. Okay.
I was working at a retirement community. I had a part-time position back then because in 2008 the economy was in recession, and all the regular jobs that I was perfectly qualified for and applied for didn't materialize. The only position that opened up was part-time at a retirement community, and I started working there. And one of the aspects of the job that I really enjoyed was encouraging seniors to tell their stories. Now, remember, we go back to the theme of storytelling from my childhood.
Right, yeah.
So I enjoyed collecting stories, especially as they came from a generation in the West, and I had absolutely no context because I didn't grow up here. So the stories they told me about the Depression era, about growing up during wars, about their men serving in the military, all of this was fascinating information. So I would collect these stories and type them up on a website so their family members could access these stories. So that was a fascinating journey for me. And in doing so, I found that the universal story is much more than my small story, right? We all have similar themes of forgiveness, loss, pain, separation, betrayal. These are all common threads in the human experience.
Right.
So I started connecting those threads with my own personal experience. And 18 months after my mother passed away, my father died as well in India.
Oh, okay.
And when he died, that just sort of exacerbated my grief experience. And when I returned to the States after his last rites, I decided that I was just going to serve my soul's calling in a much bigger way. So for the next 2 years, which I call the apprenticeship of my soul, I simply went to nursing homes and spaces where the elderly lived and spent time being a companion, listening to their stories, just sitting with them. I trained to be a hospice volunteer. I sat by the bedsides of many dying people. And through this experience of serving others, without really worrying about money or what I was being compensated for, what I received, I healed myself. I think that was truly how I healed my broken heart, in connecting with the broken hearts of so many people who also were going through some kind of a painful experience. That is what led me to my eventual healing. In bits and pieces, I was able to put the broken pieces of my heart back together.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, that's something I expect. I mean, usually, like, when you try to heal yourself, you should go, from what I understand, you should try to go inside and rather than reach out and find some commonality with others. So that's an interesting manner, an interesting way that you found. Okay. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that it does involve going inward, because what led me to reach out to other people is three questions that came to me after my
Okay.
mother died.
All right.
The first question was, who am I? The
Okay.
second question was, what is the meaning of this life?
Okay.
And the third question was, what am I meant to do with this life? So in trying to find a response to those three questions, I was led to serve. And I realized that giving and receiving love is really the ultimate purpose of every human being that lives on planet Earth. And so every time I sat with someone who was aching, someone who was in deep pain, someone who needed a companion, and listened to their story, or was able to give them a shoulder rub, or alleviated their suffering in some small way,
Right.
I felt that I was in service to my soul. And
Right.
that truly led to my healing.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Great insight right there, actually. Okay, so Uma, I'd just like to engage in a before and after conversation here. What would you say you were like before your mother was diagnosed? And what would you say you were like after you went through the entire healing process, the entire healing journey?
What a wonderful question, Alexander. Thank you for asking this question. Not too many people get to it, so I'm really grateful you're asking me the question.
I do try.
I always say that the Uma who was before my mother's passing, she died when my mother died, and I
Okay.
was reborn from the ashes of my mother's death.
Mhm.
The person who I used to be was, like most people, completely absorbed in raising a family, going to work, paying the bills,
Right.
wondering about the next success, the next promotion, very occupied with worldly concerns.
Mhm.
The Uma who emerged after my mother passed away is one who tries to live more aligned with her soul's calling.
Right.
My life today is more about reaching out to people, connecting with them, and helping them through their grief and loss experience, their search for their life purpose, their soul's meaning, and how they're meant to live. I know today what truly matters in my life. I know that my life is a finite period of time. I'm not going to be here forever.
Right.
And therefore, I need to get really, really busy doing what I came here to do. There's no time to waste.
Mhm.
And so, because I know what truly matters and that my time is limited, I live much more meaningfully and purposefully, serving, loving, being grateful for what I have every single day.
Wow, that's really great. I mean, let's face it, not many people actually realize what they're here for or find out what
Yeah.
really resonates with them. So, on my end, I must say it's not fun having a tragedy take place, but at least, this came out of it.
Yeah, it's often that the treasures of our lives are buried in the traumas. So when we look inside the ruins of a situation, when we re-examine tragedy and say, what am I meant to learn from this experience? How am I meant to grow through this experience? Then the experience becomes meaningful in shaping your life, in moving you to your next chapter. But if we stay stuck in that space of loss and grief, we become bitter and resentful, we contract our hearts, and we stay in that space of pain. But pain is only given to open us more fully to living the human experience, to making us realize that our time here is not forever, and so we need to get about the business of living it meaningfully, purposefully, enjoying ourselves. Life
Right.
is meant to be joyous, and if that message comes through a tragedy, then we are better off because we serve not just ourselves, but everyone else in our lives.
Right, I got that, and certainly your viewpoint about pain, it's very interesting because what's coming up for me is that your viewpoint of pain is that it's not that pain should be avoided, but it's sort of like pain is sort of like an alarm of some sort that something's awry in one's life.
That's beautiful, Alexander. It is. Pain is really an alarm. It's a wake-up call. Yes.
I got that. Okay, so let's say you came across someone who's presently dealing with grief, as in really, really, really deep grief, and for whatever reason, you only have enough time to tell that person one thing about the nature of grief or about grief itself. What would be that thing that you say, and why would you say that?
I think the first thing I would say to that person is that grief is a universal experience. So often we step into this bubble of pain and we think somehow life is unfair to me. I have been chosen to experience this pain, and why me and why now? But those are disempowering questions. So what I would say to the person is, in this moment, there are millions of people all over the world who are going through the exact same thing that you are. You may not know them by name, you may not know what country and culture they live in, but there are people who are going through exactly what you are. And how can you, with what you have experienced in this moment, reach out a helping hand and make their pain a little less because of what you have been through?
Okay, all right. Well, that's certainly something to think about. I mean, not many people would certainly think about reaching out to others when they're in pain. Okay, so with regards to the book, I mean, do you have an ultimate vision for your book? I mean, do you have any idea what you would like to have happen, at the end of all this, if like everyone read your book?
My ultimate vision is to be on Oprah Winfrey's couch.
All right, okay.
How's that for a vision, huh?
That's very clear. That's very simple. Yeah, why not?
Yes. Well, I really would like my book to reach as many people as possible all over the world. I believe that mine is really a global story. Although it's set in India and the US, it's set in my personal experience. Like I said, it is a universal experience. Everyone goes through grief and loss.
Yes.
And so my hope is that by using that as the theme of my book, I'm able to connect to the stories that everyone is going through at this moment in time, and that my hope and prayer is that my book reaches millions of people all over the world.
All right, I got that. So what would you tell potential readers? People might be kind of curious, might be kind of interested in reading the book.
I would say invest in a copy, start reading it, and see how the threads of my story connect with the threads of yours. Because ultimately we are all part of the human experience. We are all made from this giant tapestry called humanity. And my threads may be yellow and pink and yours may be green and blue, but they do crisscross at some point in that tapestry. So you will, in my voice, in my story, in my words, recognize aspects of yourself and your own life in ways you didn't think possible when you started. So that is my invitation to every reader.
Okay, cool. So right there, invitation right there to our listeners. So Uma, are there any other stories or topics that you might want to explore as an author in the future? I know you're a big storyteller, so...
Okay, I'm drawn to both fiction and non-fiction. I'm working on my next book right now, which is a collection of essays about life and life's lessons. So I'm always interested in sharing my stories as a way of opening a door for someone else and saying, if this story taught me something, here's the value, the lesson that I learned, which I'd love to share with you. So in writing both fiction and non-fiction, my eye is always on how can I share this lesson with my reader who is also connected to me, although he or she may not know me at this point. But because, like I said, we're all part of the great human oneness, we connect with each other through our words. And so in telling my stories, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, my goal, my intention is to connect with every reader and somehow better their life, inspire them, uplift their spirit in some way.
Okay, all right. That's certainly a noble intention right there. So, Uma, in the last few minutes, I'd like now to ask a few questions that might give our listeners other insight into who you are presently as a person. Would this be okay with you?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So my first question is, what activity do you like the best?
Reading.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I love reading. I couldn't be without a book. It's as essential for me as breathing is, I would say.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
All right, okay. So what activity do you like the least?
I would say shopping.
Shopping, okay.
Yeah, shopping drains my energy, it tires me out for some reason. When I walk into a store, I know exactly what I want to buy. I buy it and I leave. I'm not a
Okay.
window shopper. I'm
Okay.
not the sort of person who can spend hours in a mall.
Okay, all right. So, in other words, you shop more or less like a guy, because I know I shop like that
Yeah.
anyway.
My husband is the wife in the family when it comes to shopping.
Okay, so he's the one who does the comparisons and takes the time and all
Yes.
that stuff. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so my last question is, what experience, profession, or activity which you have not yet experienced would you like to experience or do at some time in the future?
I would love to go on a cruise as a way to teach. So, teach a workshop on a cruise. That's on my bucket list.
Oh, okay.
I'd love to do that, yeah.
Okay, all right. So interesting. Okay, I got that. So, in closing, the book is Losing Amma, Finding Home, a memoir about love, loss, and life's detours. The author is Uma Girish, and you can find her book at her website, umagirish.com. That's Uma Girish, one word. Or you can also go to Amazon, since it's also sold there, both in Kindle format and in paperback. So, Uma, wish we could talk longer. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being on Author Story. It's very inspiring, and I learned quite a bit about just listening to your story.
Thank you, Alexander. I must say, you are a very insightful interviewer. You came up with some great questions, which helped me tell my story and experience as well. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome, and thank you very much for the feedback. And we'll be back next time on Author Story with another inspiring author.
I hope you will visit Amazon and pick up a copy to read. I promise you it's a wonderful, inspiring story set in two cultures, India and the US, and you won't be disappointed. Happy reading!